Justice Michael Langston nearly choked on his morning coffee when he saw the piece of paper taped to his garage door. The bold, red-inked words, "Violation Notice," were impossible to miss. His eyes scanned the details beneath it. Unauthorized parking fine. $500 due immediately. Michael blinked, rereading the notice. This had to be some sort of mistake. He owned this house. This was his garage. Who else was supposed to park here? At the bottom of the notice was a signature, written in elaborate, self-important cursive. Patricia Whitmore, HOA president. Michael sighed. He had never met Patricia in person, but the stories had reached him quickly. She was infamous in the neighborhood, a middle-aged woman with a penchant for strict rules, an ever-present clipboard, and a merciless grip on the community. The type of person who fined kids for riding bikes too loudly or reprimanded retirees for planting the wrong type of flowers. Michael pulled out his phone and dialed the number listed on the notice, expecting a quick resolution. After nearly 30 minutes of hold music, an off-key instrumental of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, a sharp voice finally answered. Hawthorne Estates Homeowners Association, this is Brenda speaking. Hi Brenda. I just received a violation notice for parking in my own garage. I assume this is a mistake. Brenda's tone turned icy. No mistake, sir. The HOA passed a regulation last month requiring special authorization to use garages as parking spaces. Michael frowned. I don't remember voting on that. It was passed by the board, not the residents. Michael rubbed his temple. Let me get this straight. I need permission to park in my own garage? Correct. And how does one obtain this so-called authorization? There's an application process, Brenda said with an audible sigh. It takes about 6 to 8 weeks for review. But in the meantime, you'll need to park elsewhere. Michael glanced outside. Large red signs lined the curbs. No street parking. Violators will be towed. He exhaled slowly. So, let me summarize. I can't park in my garage. I can't park in the driveway. And I can't park on the street. Where, exactly, do you suggest I park? Brenda's silence stretched for several beats before she replied. Sir, I don't make the rules. If you have an issue, take it up with the board. Click. Michael stared at his phone in disbelief. This was getting interesting. That evening, Michael decided to attend the HOA board meeting. He expected to clear things up quickly, but as he approached the entrance, a burly security guard blocked his path. Name: Justice Michael Langston. The guard scanned a list. You're not allowed in. Michael raised an eyebrow. Excuse me. HOA policy states that only residents in good standing may attend meetings. Michael almost laughed. I am in good standing. The guard shook his head. Not according to our records. You have an unpaid fine. Michael pinched the bridge of his nose. So let me get this straight. I can't contest the fine because I'm not allowed in the meeting. But I'm not allowed in the meeting because of the fine? Correct. Michael let out a slow breath. He had spent his career dealing with legal loopholes, but this was on another level of absurdity. If they wouldn't let him in physically, he'd get in another way. Taking a seat on a nearby bench, he pulled out his phone and dialed into the HOA's Zoom meeting. The screen flickered, and there she was, Patricia Whitmore, a woman in her mid-50s with a hairstyle that practically screamed, I want to speak to your manager. Before we begin, Patricia announced, I'd like to remind everyone that the HOA's rules are not suggestions. They are mandatory. This community thrives on structure, order, and consequences for rule breakers. Michael unmuted. Speaking of rule breakers, let's talk about this fine you slapped on my garage. Patricia's smile faltered. She squinted at her screen. Who is this? Justice Michael Langston. Homeowner. Supreme Court judge. Victim of what I can only assume is the world's most ridiculous HOA violation. The Zoom chat went dead silent. A few other homeowners coughed awkwardly. Patricia regained her composure. Mr. Langston. Justice Langston. Her left eye twitched. Justice Langston, the HOA does not make exceptions. The garage regulation was passed fairly. Michael leaned back. I don't recall voting on it. Patricia's smirk returned. Homeowners do not vote on board decisions. That would lead to chaos. Michael exhaled slowly. So, you're a dictator with a clipboard. Patricia's smile vanished. That is highly inappropriate. So is fining me $500 for parking in my own garage. Her lips thinned. Rules are rules. If you don't like it, you're welcome to appeal at the HOA meeting. Michael tilted his head. You mean the meeting I was just banned from? A few residents chuckled. Patricia's jaw tightened. Your fine has now doubled for failure to comply. Michael let out a sharp laugh. Oh, we're just making up numbers now? Why stop at 1,000? Let's go for 10. Patricia ignored him. If you do not pay within 72 hours, a lien will be placed on your home. The Zoom chat exploded with whispers. A homeowner unmuted. Wait, you can do that. Patricia nodded smugly. We can, and we will. Michael leaned forward, his voice deadly calm. You just made a very big mistake. Patricia scoffed. Oh, and why is that? Michael smiled. Because I'm going to make sure this HOA doesn't exist by the time I'm done. Patricia laughed. Please. You're just a homeowner. You have no power here. Michael's grin widened. That's where you're wrong. I have more power than you could possibly imagine. Patricia rolled her eyes. Oh, please. What are you going to do? Sue us. Michael's grin turned razor sharp. Bingo. The Zoom call went dead silent. Patricia scoffed. You wouldn't. Michael ended the call and tossed his phone into his pocket. Oh, but he would. And by the time he was done, Patricia Whitmore would be begging for mercy. Michael wasted no time. That same night, he sat in his home office, drafting a lawsuit against the Hawthorne Estates HOA. He wasn't just challenging the fine, he was coming after them for fraudulent enforcement of HOA policies, unlawful property liens, failure to allow homeowners due process, and financial mismanagement. By morning, the papers were filed. The battle had begun. By the afternoon, a process server knocked on Patricia Whitmore's door. The moment she opened it, a thick envelope was thrust into her hands. "You've been served," the man said before turning away. Patricia's eyes widened as she tore the envelope open. The first line made her stomach drop. Langston v. Hawthorne Estates HOA, civil litigation. The war had officially begun. Patricia Whitmore stood frozen in her doorway, her hands shaking as she reread the summons. Her mind raced through the implications. A lawsuit? From a Supreme Court justice? Her stomach twisted in knots. She rushed inside, slamming the door behind her and flipping through the documents. The accusations were severe: fraudulent enforcement of HOA policies, unlawful property liens, failure to allow homeowners due process, and financial mismanagement. This wasn't just about a parking fine anymore. This was an existential threat to her power. Without hesitation, she grabbed her phone and dialed the HOA's legal counsel, Richard Hoffman. "Richard, we have a problem," she snapped as soon as he answered. "What now, Patricia?" Richard's weary voice came through the line. "We're being sued." Silence. Then, a slow exhale. "By who?" Patricia's grip on the phone tightened. "Justice Michael Langston." Richard's pause was longer this time. "As in, Supreme Court Justice Michael Langston?" "Yes." "Who else?" Patricia's voice rose in panic. Richard groaned. "Patricia, what did you do?" "I did my job. I enforced HOA rules." "Let me guess. You fined him for something ridiculous, didn't you?" Patricia scoffed. "He parked in his garage without authorization." Richard muttered something under his breath before speaking. "Patricia, that's... I don't need a lecture. I need a solution. He's suing us, and if we don't act fast, this HOA could be dismantled." Richard sighed. "All right. I'll review the case and meet with you and the board tomorrow. But I'm telling you right now, we're in trouble." Patricia slammed the phone down. She refused to lose. Not to some judge. Michael sat in his home office, sipping coffee as he reviewed his legal strategy. The case was airtight. He wasn't just aiming to win. He was aiming to crush the HOA's abusive system. The next morning, he received a call from his friend and fellow attorney, Daniel Carter. "I saw the case filing," Daniel said with a chuckle. "So, you're finally taking on the HOA menace?" Michael smirked. "About time someone did. Need help?" Michael leaned back in his chair. "I'd love a second set of eyes on this." "Consider it done." With Daniel on board, Michael felt even more confident. This wasn't just a lawsuit. This was war. And he had every intention of winning. On the night of the emergency HOA board meeting, tensions ran high. The board members, who once sat smugly in their positions of power, now looked uneasy. Patricia, however, held her ground, glaring at them all. "We will not be intimidated," she declared. "This is our community, and we make the rules." One of the board members, an older man named Greg, cleared his throat. "Patricia, with all due respect, we might have a serious problem. Michael Langston is a Supreme Court justice," another member, Linda, pointed out. "We can't fight this like it's some petty dispute." Patricia scoffed. "He's still just a homeowner. And as long as I'm president, we fight back." A few members exchanged worried glances, but no one dared challenge her outright. At least, not yet. The first pretrial hearing took place 2 weeks later. Michael walked into the courtroom, cool and composed. Across from him, Patricia sat next to Richard Hoffman, who already looked exhausted. The judge, Rebecca Simmons, entered the room. Michael knew her well. He had mentored her early in her career. "This court will now hear the preliminary arguments in Langston v. Hawthorne Estates HOA," she announced. "Justice Langston, you may proceed." Michael stood, his voice steady. "Your Honor, the HOA has imposed fraudulent fines, denied homeowners due process, and unlawfully threatened liens against properties. This lawsuit seeks to hold them accountable and restore fairness to the community." Judge Simmons nodded and turned to Richard. "Mr. Hoffman, your response." Richard cleared his throat. "Your Honor, the HOA was simply enforcing its regulations. Homeowners are aware of the rules when they move in out." Michael cut in smoothly. "Your Honor, homeowners did not vote on these rules. The board imposed them unilaterally." Judge Simmons frowned. "Mr. Hoffman, is that true?" Richard hesitated. "Well, yes." Simmons sighed. "Then we have a problem." Patricia stiffened. The tide was turning. As the trial continued, the case against the HOA only got stronger. Michael and his legal team presented document after document, exposing the corruption under Patricia's leadership. Financial records showed outrageous misallocations, community funds used for administrative expenses that turned out to be Patricia's personal spa days and extravagant lunches. Emails surfaced revealing deliberate efforts to fine homeowners unfairly. One particularly damning piece of evidence was a leaked memo from Patricia herself, instructing board members to find creative ways to generate revenue through violations. The courtroom was silent as Judge Simmons reviewed the evidence. Then, she looked at Patricia. "Ms. Whitmore, do you have an explanation for this?" Patricia's face was ghostly pale. Aye. Michael leaned forward. "Your Honor, I'd like to request an immediate audit of all HOA financial transactions over the last 5 years." Judge Simmons nodded. Granted, the final blow had landed. Patricia knew it. And for the first time, she realized she was losing. The audit took a week, and the results were devastating. Over $300,000 in funds had been misappropriated under Patricia's leadership. Community dues had been spent on personal vacations, luxury goods, and even an expensive renovation on Patricia's own home. With nowhere to hide, Patricia was formally removed as HOA president. But that wasn't the worst part. The district attorney's office opened an official investigation into fraud and embezzlement charges. And when officers arrived at Patricia's house with a warrant, the entire neighborhood came out to watch. Michael stood at the edge of the crowd, arms crossed, as Patricia was led out in handcuffs. "You can't do this to me," she screeched. "I built this community. I am the HOA. Michael smirked. "Not anymore." With that, the nightmare of the Hawthorne Estates HOA finally came to an end. And the neighborhood? For the first time in years, it could finally breathe. With Patricia Whitmore removed and the corrupt HOA dismantled, Hawthorne Estates felt like a new place. For years, the neighborhood had operated under fear, residents constantly worried about receiving fines for trivial things like the color of their front doors or the placement of their trash bins. But now, that reign of terror was over. Michael stood on his porch, sipping coffee, watching his families enjoy their newfound freedom. Children rode their bikes without being harassed by clipboard-wielding board members. Neighbors held conversations without paranoia. People actually enjoyed their homes again. A few days after Patricia's arrest, the community held a block party. It wasn't just a celebration, it was a statement. There were no more ridiculous rules about loud music, grilling in driveways, or having more than 2 guests over at a time. Laughter and music filled the streets, something that hadn't happened in years. Michael walked through the party, shaking hands with neighbors who had once been too afraid to challenge the HOA. He even spotted Greg and Linda, the former board members who had distanced themselves from Patricia before it was too late. "You really did it," Greg said, shaking his head in disbelief. "You took her down." Michael smirked. "She took herself down. I just gave her a little push." Linda chuckled. "Well, we owe you one. I never thought I'd see the day when this neighborhood was finally free." Michael nodded. "Neither did I. But we're here now." Despite Patricia's removal, there was still one last thing left to do. Make sure no HOA like hers ever came back. Michael worked with the remaining board members to draft a new set of community guidelines, ones that prevented any future HOA from having unchecked power. A special vote was held, and the community overwhelmingly approved the new rules. No HOA board could impose fines without a full neighborhood vote. Financial records must be made public every quarter. No board member could serve more than 2 consecutive terms. Any attempt to reinstate an authoritarian HOA would require unanimous approval. With those rules in place, the power of any future HOA was permanently limited. Hawthorne Estates would never suffer under another Patricia Whitmore again. While the neighborhood moved forward, Patricia's downfall continued. Her arrest had made local news, and she quickly became the poster child for HOA corruption. The financial audit revealed even more misdeeds, misappropriated funds, fraudulent charges, and even an attempt to forge signatures on past regulations. Her trial was swift. With overwhelming evidence against her, she was convicted of fraud, embezzlement, and abuse of power. The judge sentenced her to 5 years in prison, along with mandatory restitution to the community. Michael attended the sentencing, sitting in the back of the courtroom. As Patricia was led away in handcuffs, she turned to him, her eyes full of fury. "You think this is over?" she hissed. Michael smirked. "It is for you." She scowled, but there was nothing she could do. Justice had been served. Months later, Hawthorne Estates continued to thrive. Property values actually increased without the restrictive HOA in place. New families moved in, drawn to the community's newfound sense of freedom. Michael received a letter from a resident, an elderly woman who had been living in fear of the HOA's absurd fines. "Dear Justice Langston, thank you for standing up for us. I never thought I'd see the day when I could enjoy my own home again. Because of you, we are free." Michael smiled as he folded the letter. This wasn't just a personal victory. It was a victory for everyone who had ever been bullied by people like Patricia Whitmore. As he walked back inside, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Daniel Carter. "Are you up for another case? I have a friend dealing with a similar HOA nightmare." Michael chuckled. Maybe this was just the beginning. A year later, Michael received an anonymous tip. Patricia, now out on parole, had moved to a small condo across town. And the best part? The new neighborhood's HOA had fined her $500 for an unauthorized decoration on her balcony. Michael laughed so hard he nearly spilled his coffee. It was poetic justice.